from a mountain in Tibet, continuing from page 85, Chapter 6. I left the Himalayas on 23 January 1960. I've never lived again in the harsh and beautiful world of the mountains where I grew up. On that final day, I clambered into a cargo plane alongside my companions. We were strapped down on the floor for the duration of the flight because there were no seats. We were each handed a bag and told that we could expect to be sick from the turbulence. Then the plane took off and we were flown down towards the plains of India and away from our old lives. I was astounded by the impossible fact of being inside this contraption high up in the sky. The noise and the stench of chemicals from the fuel were terrible. The only way I could tell how fast we were traveling was by peering out of a window and tracking the shadow of the plane on the ground far below. I didn't look down for long. It was all too overwhelming. Then I felt my stomach heave, and I vomited over and over again into the bag. Looking round, I saw that everyone else was in the same predicament. Fortunately, the flight was short. We were being taken from the mountain town of Tuting to Dimapur in the state of Nagaland. Our final destination was the transit camp at Missimari in neighboring Assam, which the Indian government had commandeered to process the exodus of Tibetan refugees. When we touched down at Dimapur, I felt a massive wave of relief. I couldn't yet comprehend having survived the 9-month-long trek to get there, or even that short but bewildering flight. I stepped onto the hot tarmac of the airstrip, and my foot sank a little into its sticky softness. The heat was difficult to believe. We were all used to the pure, cold air of the Tibetan plateau. I immediately began to sweat in my thick sheepskin coat, which was stinking and encrusted with grime of many months. I thought I might pass out. Jamyang steered me away from the plane and towards a jeep that was waiting to take us to the camp at Missimari, several hundred miles away. My mind was now so numbed by the new sights, sounds, and smells that I barely registered the landscape I was passing through. I don't remember anything until we were approaching the bridge over the Brahmaputra. I looked down at the brown, sluggish water. I couldn't connect this wide, slow river with the freezing, fast-moving waters where we had been shot at by the Chinese soldiers. The attack already seemed as if it had happened in a different world, a lifetime ago. I was so tired that when we eventually arrived at the camp, I could hardly follow the instructions about where we should sleep, and eat. One thing I did notice, though, was that the person in charge was a white woman in Indian dress. I had never seen a white person before. European travelers were virtually unknown in Tibet, and in fact had passed into folklore as boogeymen to scare children with. Back in Darek, my parents used to tell us that if we were naughty, a white-skinned man with a long nose would come and eat us. A refugee camp in Assam was scarcely a more likely place to find a Western woman than Tibetan highlands, but there she was. She introduced herself to us as Mrs. Frida Betty, and she took pity on us immediately. Frida Betty would become one of the most significant people in my life, in all our lives. She was instrumental in ensuring that the Tibetan Buddhist culture, embodied in the Lamas and the Tulkus, was not lost. And went on to be a key figure in disseminating Tibetan Buddhism throughout the West. Frida later wrote in her account of working in Misamari that we were the most pitiful group of refugees she had yet seen, our bodies emaciated and eyes sunk deep in their sockets. On that first day, she invited us back to her tent for sweet tea and to tell her our story of escape. When she discovered that several of our group were Tulkus, she promised to do what she could to assist us. But as she led us to our spots in a huge tent, and I stumbled after my brother Akon, I could not imagine what she might do to help. All I could take in was squalor, and what seemed to be like thousands of miserable people. I was choking on the filthy, dusty air, and I still couldn't believe how hot it was. I knew I should be glad to be alive, but in that moment it seemed to me that we had swapped a freezing hell for a hot one. The modern state of India was still only 13 years old on the day I arrived at the camp. The authorities were doing their best to cope with the influx of refugees, but they were seriously overstretched. It was a delicate political situation for India, given the size and might of neighboring China. But Nehru's government had received His Holiness the Dalai Lama with all due respect, and given him assurances that the Tibetan people would also be welcome. This generous offer of humanitarian support was extended partly because of the long cultural and spiritual ties between Tibet and India, but also as recompense for having failed to object to the Chinese annexation of Tibet back in 1950. We were grateful, but the situation was desperate on the ground. Frida Betty was an extraordinary woman, British by birth, but Indian by marriage and inclination. She had been jailed for campaigning for Indian independence, and was famous throughout India for her political and social work. She had overseen the relief efforts for refugees in Kashmir after the horrific fighting unleashed by partition, and also deeply sympathetic to Buddhism, and a close contact of the Prime Minister, Nehru. So when she heard that the Tibetan exiles were suffering in terrible conditions, she badgered Nehru into sending her to do something about it. By the time we arrived, Frida's efforts had already improved things, but they were still bad. There were about 1,000 people in the camp, which was a run-down army base that hadn't been used since the end of the Second World War. There were temporary bamboo structures that had been put up for the first wave of arrivals, but they were all full by the time we got there, so we simply headed for a tent made of sacking on the edge of the camp. There wasn't enough water, even for drinking, let alone for washing. So conditions were squalid, and there was a desperate shortage of medical attention. New arrivals were suffering from injuries, malnutrition, and frostbite. Many of us had lost toes, fingers, or noses during the winter climb over the Himalayas. There was plentiful food, but it was not what we were used to, and we didn't know how to cook it. Worse, our bodies struggled to digest the rice, vegetables, and spices. I thought I would be sick the first time I tried to eat dal and rice, and it took me a long time to learn to like it. Conditions grew worse and worse. The camp was actually shrinking despite the constant stream of new arrivals, because there were more people dying of malnutrition and disease than there were arriving. We were completely vulnerable to diseases such as measles and tuberculosis that were unknown in our country, and they began to spread like wildfire. There was the problem of unsanitary conditions, which led to outbreaks of dysentery and cholera. But perhaps the greatest challenge of all was that created by the ordeal we had undergone. We had lost our families, our homeland, our entire way of life. I saw parents whose children had died on the journey, and children who had been separated from their families and were alone. There was a mood of desperation, of terrible grief. Now that the crisis was past, and we had obtained our objective, what would become of us? We were alive, but how could we heal? We had nothing. Where would we go, and what would we do? Trungpa and Akon had no more answers than I did to the practical questions, but as ever, their faith was unshakable. On the day after our arrival, they set about leading us in prayers and encouraging people to continue their practice. I tried to join in, but had little appetite for it. Those of us who escaped together stayed in a tight little huddle. Jamyang tried to reassure me that once we moved beyond the transit camp, things would improve. But I could not understand this world I found myself in. It was all too alien. Continuing with a new chapter and a new country.
Yes. Yes. It must have been strange for Lama Yeshe to be an aeroplane for the very first time. It flew up into the sky.
Imagine that.
It probably reminded him of Guru Rinpoche's prophecy, when the iron bird flies.
Oh, yes.
Yes. Yes, so.
He probably would have thought that would be sometime well to the future.
Yeah.
And then he was there experiencing it.
That's right, yeah. It happened there and then. And then it's strange flying like that for his very first time in an aeroplane, you know. And of course, when I can understand why they were getting sick. You know, it's like something similar to seasickness, you know.
That's right.
It's rough, you know. Anyway.
And it was a cargo plane, so it wasn't designed for transporting people. That's why they had to be strapped to the floor.
That's right, and they didn't have any seating. But anyway, when he got off and he started to sweat with that big sheepskin coat he had on, I bet he couldn't get rid of it quick enough.
That's right.
Yes.
You would need brand new everything for a new place.
Yeah, see, there wasn't enough water to get a proper shower or a bath, you know. The water was scarce, but however, he managed to get on. The water was rationed. They managed to manage with that. And and all that dust they were breathing in wasn't good for their lungs. And maybe that's how Lama Yeshe got his TB.
Most likely, because a lot of sickness was going around in those camps.
TB was flying around.
Yes. It's before there was a cure, wasn't it?
That's right. Before there was a cure. Tuberculosis, yes. So there's not a lot people could do but under the circumstances to avoid these things, you know. So it's just the strongest and the luckiest ones were able to survive it, you know.
That's right.
But however.
So he's gone from one set of hardships to a completely different set of hardships.
Yes.
And these are very challenging because he doesn't have any prior experience with any of these things that are arising. Everything is brand new.
That's right. Mm-hmm. A complete new experience, you know, a new way of life. And that's the way to take a bit of getting used to, you know.
Isn't that amazing that on their first day they meet Frida Betty?
Yeah, I knew right away before it was Frida Betty. I knew right away that was her.
It was such good fortune for them that she was there.
Yeah.
It would make everything from that moment on a different experience.
Yeah. So I'm sure she might have much more to improve the situation that was already there, you know.
Yes.
It was just a starting point.
And you know her too.
Oh yes, I met her.
So now the story has an additional person that you've had a personal experience with. As the story continues to unfold, it will become more and more familiar, and also more and more people that have overlapped.
Yes, I met her at Samueling. Yes. So everything's a complete new experience.
Including the foods as well.
Yeah. So it'll take a little time to get settled into this new life, you know.
This is sort of the gateway to the world opening up for these young men.
Yeah.
And everyone that left Tibet with them. So This is a very brand new chapter.
Yes.
Indeed.
Mm-hmm.
And not without a lot of challenges also.
Oh, had its challenges.
But isn't it amazing how Akwang and Trungpa immediately set up prayers?
Yeah.
It was so beautiful because they were caring so much about the other people that might not have the same resources that they had, inner resources they had,
that's right.
to cope with the challenges.
Yeah.
So I'm sure that they're going to make the life experience much better for the other people in the camp because they'll give a spiritual focus.
Yeah, they're doing their best to help everybody, you know. It was quite good. It helped to maybe boost morale a bit,
Yes.
although it was at that time that everything was very low, maybe that would help you, rise the morale a wee bit,
That's right. Give the refugees a connection with something very beautiful from what they've left behind.
That's right.
So they can have a continuity. The story will continue to unfold. We're not very far along in the book yet, so there's a lot more to look forward to.
Yeah. So there you go. That's it.
Okay.
Yes.